This is a hybrid event, so in addition to everybody that's here today, we've got a load of people online as well listening in to this talk. So thank you to both audiences for coming. My name's Steve Grimes. I'm the John Sock Theme Lead for Climate and Ecology, and I've been helping to organise this series of talks that's happened around the UK. Okay, started off in Plymouth, my hometown, where I'm based at the university there, and then extended up to Glasgow, and then back down now to Birmingham. The series finishes with a two-day meeting in Burlington House in early September. If you've not had the opportunity to listen to some of the other talks, all of them are available on the John Sock YouTube channel. Okay, so you can access recordings of those talks there. But as I said, we're here now in Birmingham, and today we've got the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Sean Wan, who's going to be talking in a minute about the impact of climate change on biodiversity through fossil insights. Just say as well, if you are in the room or you're online, at the end of the talk, there'll be the opportunity to ask questions as normal. If you want to, though, start building up some questions as we go along, there's a Menti number up there. You can log into Menti, and if you feel you have a question but don't want to wait until the very end, if you put it into there, we'll get to those questions at the end of the talk. So we'll take questions from the audience, but also from those online, including the. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Sean. And yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Hey. So I assume people online can hear me. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming, for joining me today, both offline and online. And here I'd like to share some of my work on the impact of climate change on biodiversity, especially using insights from the fossil record. And I'm actually trained as an ecologist. And as ecologists, we are all interested in understanding biodiversity, how it was formed, and also how it might change in the future. And we are all also rather concerned about the current crisis with regard to biodiversity loss, because as we hear in the news quite often now, that many species are faced with risk of extinction. And to mitigate these kind of situations, we really need a deep understanding of how extinction happens and why. And for this, the fossil record can be a very powerful tool because they provide a direct window to a long history of extinctions, including the mass extinction events and the loss of whole groups like these iconic trilobites and the dinosaurs, which once dominated the Earth, but are now extinct. In the case of the dinosaurs, they were wiped out during a mass extinction event about 66 million years ago, leaving behind the ancestors of the modern birds. And so some people think we are on the brink of the sixth mass extinction, and others think we are already in it. So in any case, it's useful to understand, for example, how the dinosaurs became so successful, and then later, how they reached their demise. And the environment was also changing all the time in many different ways, not just the climate, but also the landscape, the habitat, which should have affected evolution. Right? So these changes could be slow and gradual or very rapid and devastating all of a sudden. But through all of these changes, some taxa actually pull through. So we can also learn from those groups that experience the changes, even mass extinction events, but are still around today, like the mammals and these clams. Both groups experience at least one mass extinction event and many other changes in the environment. And they were heavily affected, yet survived to become important players of today's ecosystems. So in groups like these, there were extinctions, but also survivals, recovery, and resilience, and transitions in the way they live and the way they function. So they provide very, very cool natural experiments of biological resources, biological responses to environmental changes. So where can we see the fossil record? The most obvious places to you might be natural history museums, their collections, right? And then also on the beach, you can pick up things. And there are also great resources in the literature, because this is a long-standing field and a lot of effort has been put into discovering and also describing fossils. But all the information and knowledge in the literature need to be synthesized to show the big pictures. There are also global fossil databases about various systems which are publicly available. And there are usually some sort of computer programs for exploring them effectively. So regardless of these approach and sources, I think we can all appreciate this new era of informatics with computational technologies and also data sciences for synthesizing all these information to better understand the large-scale dynamics of biodiversity. And that includes combining paleontological and neontological data. So for today's talk, I want to focus on the time after the last mass extinction to consider how the continuous climate change had influenced the biota. I will discuss this in two specific systems, which will also allow me to touch on both land and marine systems. The first one is about comparing different environmental influences on mammalian diversity and evolution. And the second one is about the extinction vulnerability of marine bivalves. So the two projects use fossil data in different ways, but I think both have important implications for how to understand and also sustainably manage the modern world. So in the first part, I'll discuss the complexity in climate impact on the ecological diversity on land through the lens of a classic organismal trait, the body size, because it really provides very useful perspectives on animal ecology and evolution. Many studies have been focused on body size because this is the trait with the most data available. It's often the first trait biologists measure when they encounter a specimen or an organism in the field, because it's relatively easy to measure, and it's a universal trait and can be measured for almost everything: terrestrial or marine, living, extinct, plant, mushrooms, vertebrates, invertebrates, even parasitic organisms. So this makes it possible to compare patterns across all these different systems. It's also related to many other aspects of forms and functions of organisms. So body size needs to be measured by individuals, but is taxon specific. For example, if you think about the typical elephants, or your British robins, or the red squirrels, or gray squirrels for that matter, they all have their typical sizes. Not only that, their close relatives, for example, all the squirrels, they tend to be of similar sizes as well. So the abundant data on body size has also promoted relevant research to identify, to establish what body size variation might or might not reflect in terms of general ecology and even evolution. For example, larger size animals typically require more food, and so likely larger areas for foraging. And their larger bodies also tend to offer higher mobility for them to roam around. And there are many other traits highly related to body size of a species. So by looking at the patterns of the diversity of body size, we can further explore higher level ecological organizations, such as how environmental variation might have shaped communities and determine lineage survivorship and also functional diversity in different systems. And this is very useful considering, for example, the current risk of losing our megafauna, which refers to the largest animals like the elephants and rhinos. And we really want to know, under the ongoing environmental changes, how they could possibly last longer. In order to make these good predictions, we can go back in time to see how it worked before with the fossil faunas. So here's the synthesis of the global diversity of body size for all the marine animals throughout the Phanerozoic, tracking back to more than 500 million years ago. So time is shown on the horizontal axis, going from deep time past on the left towards more recently on the right. And you can see 3 black lines there, indicating that both the maximum and the mean size of everything altogether have generally increased through time. But the trend of the minimum size is less obvious, partly because larger things are more likely to be preserved in the fossil record and then be discovered and collected and studied. So the minimum size at each time bin in each time unit is more sensitive to how much effort was put into studying the fossils. But overall, I think this is obvious that this generally looks like an increasing range of body size. We can also see the behaviors of the different groups represented by the different colors here. The lines of the same colors tend to be clustered together and have their own dynamics from time to time. And the same goes for the terrestrial animals on the right. In particular, we've known for long that globally, the body size of mammals here in light green generally increase during the Cenozoic after the last mass extinction event, about 66 million years ago. So what I was more interested in was to break down the global patterns into regional dynamics and consider them as natural experiments of how the different environmental setups in the different regions affected body size evolution. We know that during the Cenozoic, the global climate was generally getting colder and drier, especially during the Neogene, about 23 million years ago up to until about 3 million years ago. At least for the warm-blooded animals, like mammals, larger bodies can have some advantages in coping with these new conditions because larger bodies tend to be better at preserving heat and surviving through harsh times. And climatic conditions also varies dramatically across space, and so does the rate of climate change, which might explain the different patterns in different regions. These changes in climatic conditions also change the vegetation systems, which make up the habitat for animals. For example, during the late Cenozoic, the temperate and warm temperate forest, represented by the dark blue and dark green dots here, seem to have persisted at larger scales in Europe. While in North America, shrublands and savannas in lighter colors became more dominant. These are more open habitats. So these two continents actually provide a very different environmental template for animal evolution. Because the data for these factors were at different resolutions and different extents, it wasn't very straightforward to compare them directly in relation to body size patterns, at least at the time of the project. But we will be trying to push towards that direction through collaborations in the future. So for now, we can make comparisons among the groups that rely on different types of food provided by this system to identify the effects of habitat changes. So for example, for the different types of herbivores, you would expect extinctions in browsers, which eat leaves and fruits from the trees. And so they prefer the closed forest habitats. And at the same time, there should have been more grazers replacing the browsers in the system. And as you can see, this general trend was previously demonstrated in Neogene mammals in North America, with the rising proportion of grazing species on the left and the decline of browsers in proportion on the right. However, it wasn't a one-by-one replacement because in the bottom left, you can see a hump shape for the dashed line, which is the total number of grazing species. In the bottom right panel, you can also see the total number of species decline through time, which is the black solid line. So based on these data, the authors suggested that there were strong indirect effects of climate change, including the change of habitats, but also the reduction in total primary productivity in the system, which essentially means less food available for the herbivores communities. So to further investigate these complications of climate change, we included a larger comparative framework and also statistical analysis to test these theories. First of all, we added Europe for comparison, another region where mammal fossils have been studied intensively. We also added mammals eating other food types. We looked at 5 mammalian orders for which we compiled data on their main food type for about 1,000 genera. For most of these genera, body size can be estimated from fossil specimens. So then we could compare body size patterns among the 4 dietary groups on the 2 continents. So we have 8 groups in total. The different continents could show different patterns, right? But if larger bodies were selected primarily for heat conservation by climate change, the groups on the same continent are expected to show similar trends in body size. In comparison, large-scale habitat changes should affect the dietary groups differently. So we wanted to compare their body size trends, but also how the diversity of body size changes through time, which can tell us something about how the trends were generated, some mechanisms, and also reflect changes in the actual faunal structure, such as different ways of partitioning the resources or the niche space among the different species. And we summarize the diversity of body size in each group from each time bin using a series of matrices and analyze their temporal trends using a series of powerful statistical analysis to separate out the effects of and compare the effects of continent and food type. Here's the result for mean body size. The different colors here represent the patterns of the different body type, the different food types, including browsers and grazers as the 2 groups of herbivores, and then the carnivores, and then the omnivores. So the points are the data per geological time bin, and then the lines represent some general trends for each group through time. And we can see a variety of patterns among the different groups, even on the same continent. This already suggests some complexity in the environmental influences. Before I show you more results, I first need to explain a condensed version of the 2 figures. Here, the x-axis is the estimated slope of a trend, and each of the mini distribution represents estimates of the slope for each of the general trends shown in the 2-panel figure on the right. And if most of the distribution is larger than 1 towards the right, even further away from the 0, like the North American browsers and grazers, it's a positive trend, meaning this variable generally increases strongly through time. In this way, patterns of all the groups can be easily illustrated in one figure for one variable, with the 4 groups from Europe on the top half, and then the North American groups at the bottom half. The reason we need to do that is because we have 8 more variables, and we want to look at them all at the same time. And I know it's a lot to look at and looks pretty chaotic, but that's kind of the point here. We don't need to go into the further details here about these results, but just notice the diversity of trends. This alone already implies a complicated impact of climate change on mammalian evolution and a likely role of habitat change, as in our habitat hypothesis. So our statistical analysis also strongly supported this theory. For all the matrix we analyze here, we found a strong combined effect of continent and food type in separating out these data. So we can also zoom into the North American herbivores, for example, where we can see the loss of browsers and similar and smaller gains of grazers in the last panel, similar to the results before. As their preferred habitats became more available, the grazers got bigger, but they more or less maintained the diversity of size shown by the range and the variance. They just move the range, the whole range with the same shape, kind of towards a larger mean without changing its shape. And in comparison, the extinction of small-sized browsers made the size range smaller, but increased the variance. Think about that for a little. What this means is that the range got smaller, but within the range, species were further apart from each other. If we can assume species of the same size tend to have similar niches, then we can see this as a thinning process of the niche space, of the niche occupancy in the fauna. In comparison, European herbivores on the top half in each figure, they show more stable diversity and body size, potentially because their environment was relatively stable during this time. So the environmental change was really impactful. And particularly habitat transition was a key factor in shaping the mammalian diversity here. Okay, so to sum up this part, we used the fossil record to show that mammalian body size evolution was likely driven by selection related to their ecological properties. And some key aspects we need to consider are the type and availability of resources in the environment, so that habitat change was a major driver in shaping and reshaping regional faunas of the mammals, and possibly other warm-blooded animals as well. Like I said earlier, we are trying to develop this research further to directly compare the environmental history with fossil data, and that would have very important implications for conservation today, as we humans are heavily modifying the global habitat. For now, our results really suggest that habitat loss might be a more critical threat to mammals than climate change per se. And overall, I want to highlight this complexity where climate change can have both direct and indirect effects on biodiversity, and also emphasizes the importance of studying the fossil record to decipher such complicated effects. Okay, so for the next part, I'll try to push the paleontological insights a bit further, closer to the modern world and to more practical aspects of biodiversity by focusing on species harvested and used by humans. And here we'll focus on the marine bivalves. So marine bivalves are just the typical shellfishes we harvest from the oceans, including both cultivated and wild. They are the mollusks that typically have two external hard shells. And bivalves are an important part of the global fishing industry, generating about 30 billion pounds a year. And like many other biological resources, they are under pressures like habitat destruction, climate change, and potentially overfishing. And their natural persistence is directly beneficial for human society. But some species can't recover even after exploitation was reduced or completely stopped. So we want to be really careful there, because compared to others, the bivalves that have economic values are under extra pressure from human activities. And of course, bivalves are also so much more than just being our food. They provide very important services in the marine ecosystem. They are part of the energy cycle, and many of them filter and clean up seawater. They can also build reefs like the corals and provide habitat for other marine organisms, including fishes. At the moment, there are more than 6,000 species that have been formally described, and they display a large diversity of morphology and ecological functions, as illustrated in the ribbon towards the top. And they are benthic animals, which means they live on the seafloor. Many burrow into the sediments. Some can swim. Some rely on symbiotic bacteria for resources. And there are even carnivorous bivalves, and which is pretty insane, considering that they don't even have a head. And all of these make them a fascinating system for biodiversity research. They can also be found across all major coastlines of the world, from pole to pole, and are very important players in coastal ecosystems across all latitudes. In this map, the warmer the color here, the higher the number of species occurring in each grid cell or pixel. And as you can see, the greatest diversity is concentrated in the tropical Indo-West Pacific for a lot of ecological and evolutionary reasons. And this area is also a hotspot for the general marine biodiversity, except for the marine mammals, which are a different story. And then we have the steepest gradients along the China coast, all the way up to Japan and Russia, and similarly down along Australia. And there are also a lot of bivalve species in deep sea, but here we focus on the shallow marine environment, as we know a lot more about them and harvest them for our use. And unlike many larger and more charismatic animals, especially mammals and amphibians, for example, we are only at the very beginning of trying to understand the risk of extinction in bivalves, which include thousands of species, not just in marine, but also in freshwater ecosystems. But the really standard red list by the International Union for Conservation of Nature has only ever evaluated less than 1,000 bivalve species, among which less than 50 are from shallow marine species. And these still include 15 species deemed as data deficient. So we really don't know that much about them. And they are never your poster child of endangered species on the front page. But as we can see here, this might be due to the lack of data that can be used to predict their future. And this is all while we continue relying on marine bivalves for food and for their ecosystem services. So here, reliable predictions for their future dynamics are critical, especially given the ongoing and projected future changes in the ocean environment. And this, again, might be one of the areas where the fossil record can be most helpful. Marine bivalves have an exceptional fossil record throughout their evolutionary history because their shells can be preserved in their living environment. And these photos were taken on a random beach in Italy when I was on holiday. But of course, no one was impressed because they were just everywhere. And just imagine the kind of questions we can ask using their fossil record about diversity, even about abundance, from local communities to global patterns throughout 500 million years of evolution. And they are indeed a classic model system in paleobiology. This is one of my typical field sites, which is a small corner of my collaborator's office. And like I said before, so much information from the published literature waiting for our synthesis using statistical tools. Okay, so one of the most asked questions is, how did climate affect extinction dynamics? There were various extents and directions of climate changes in the past. And again, this is the global mean temperature for the last 66 million years. By comparing the climate history and the evolution history of bivalves, we can compare different hypotheses about this. For example, we can ask, was extinction often elevated by certain climatic condition? Or was it the change? Was it the rate of change or the direction of change? So in an earlier study, we tested these hypotheses for the global extinction rate in marine bivalves, shown at the bottom panel. These are per taxon extinction rate, global per taxon extinction rate, calculated for each geological time bin. And you don't need to read into the actual values here, but just notice the general dynamics of ups and downs. And the top panel shows the trend of global climate once again. We then decomposed the climate patterns into different factors, including the mean temperature for each time bin, and then the rate of change and the extent of fluctuation, again, in each time bin. We then used statistical analysis to compare which of these best accounted for the rises and falls of the extinction rate at the bottom. And we found clear dominance of the rate of change in driving extinctions of marine bivalves during the Cenozoic. It's more important than the actual temperature per se, the direction of the change, or the smaller fluctuation around the general trend of change. So then based on these information, my collaborators then went on to develop a matrix called Pearl based on 3 essential components. The average genus extinction rate in the taxonomic family throughout the Cenozoic to reflect their general sensitivity to past changes. The present-day species geographic range size to reflect some dispersal ability and potential buffer against some changes. And then the thermal range captured by its natural occurrences and also seasonality, again related to how they experience potential changes. So the geographic range and thermal range are inverted so that species with smaller range are considered more vulnerable to environmental stresses. And then the 2 ranges are both needed because they are not related, tightly related in marine bivalves. Just imagine many tropical and polar species can occur across very large geographic areas where the temperature varies very little. So then the 3 components were rescaled to be between 0 and 1, so that they all have equal contribution to the final Pearl score for each species. So in this way, this Pearl reflects a relative vulnerability among all the species being assessed, and the matrix was actually shown to be effective in predicting the victims and survivors in climate-related extinction events from very well-described fossil faunas. And even though human influence is not explicitly incorporated here, the Pearl score can tell us about their intrinsic vulnerability to extinction. For example, in the Pearl paper, they calculated the Pearl score for all the bivalve species and then show the proportion of the bivalves being the most vulnerable species across the world. The projection here of the map stretches out the polar regions, but as we know, Antarctica is actually quite small and disconnected from other shallow marine regions. So Antarctica has a lot of endemic species there, limited to that particular region, and then living within a very small temperature range. In comparison, the tropics has the most species, but many of them are also endemic to the tropics, where temperature doesn't change much across space. So even some small changes in climate could feel very substantial to these species as well. So armed with all these fossil insights and a handy tool, we can now come back to the bivalve species that have economic value. We started with the list from the annual capture report by the FAO, which shows a concentration of exploited species in Northeast Atlantic. This didn't feel right. So we looked into the literature, including local publications and survey reports, and added about 700 species and shifted the hotspot of exploited species to the tropical Indo-West Pacific, where the global marine biodiversity is also highest. Note that this is based on their natural geographic occurrences, geographic distributions, rather than where they are being harvested. We don't have data for that yet. And that we then examine their intrinsic vulnerability to provide some baseline expectation of their future. Although the number of exploited species is largely related to the total number of bivalve species in the region, the proportion of exploited species is higher outside these largest diversity hotspots, mainly along the west coast of major continents. And these regions also tend to have lower bivalve diversity when compared with other regions at the same latitude, which is generally a good predictor of diversity. We currently don't have enough data to map where the species are being exploited, so we cannot directly assess the link between human activity and diversity level. But these patterns at least suggest that we have a disproportionate demand on these regional faunas and overexploitation will have larger impacts on these ecosystems. We apply the Pearl Index as well. Historically, exploited families had similar extinction rate as unexploited families. So the two distributions are not statistically distinguishable. In addition, exploited species generally have larger geographic and thermal ranges. So as you would expect, based on the Pearl matrix, exploited species, again in red here, are relatively resistant to environmental changes when considered among all bivalve species. And this is certainly good news. But remember, we only have data to assess their intrinsic vulnerability based on their biological traits and also deep time history. But they cannot tell us to what extent these species could withstand exploitation. So we cannot safely assume that human exploitation will not drive these species to extinction. And overexploitation can certainly do that to any species with or without environmental pressures at the same time. And once that happens, think about that, what are we left with? The less resistant species, making our oceans even more susceptible to ecosystem collapse. Also, if we look at the most vulnerable species, for example, those above the 80% quantile of all bivalve species, indicated by the first blue dashed lines on the top, they do still include some exploited species, especially our beloved scallops and oysters. In particular, the family of scallops had relatively high extinction rate in the past, suggesting higher sensitivity to environmental changes overall, whereas a lot of oyster species tend to be highly endemic. So we urgently need some formal assessment on the impact of exploitation for these species and for many more above the global median. We map these intrinsically vulnerable species above the median here, and the color shows what proportion of these vulnerable species have been reported as exploited by humans. We can see in some regions, this proportion is quite high. And if we compare this map to, for example, those showing the future climate change projected by IPCC, we can find some similar hotspots, unfortunately. Which means that in these regions, the most vulnerable species might be at very high risk of extinction due to a combined pressure of ongoing environmental changes and human exploitation. Okay, to sum up this part, we use fossil insights to evaluate the vulnerability of exploited bivalves to extinction. Based on their traits and evolutionary history, exploited bivalves tend to be intrinsically resistant to environmental changes that are often associated with deep time extinction in this group. However, we cannot assume the exploited bivalves are completely safe from extinctions because we currently do not have data to directly assess their absolute risk of extinction and consider the ongoing global changes in human activity. So such an assessment are urgently needed for sustainable management of these resources. What we can do here is to provide baseline expectations of the vulnerability of these exploited species and their regional ecosystems. This can help set up priority targets, for example, for formal assessments on their extinction risk, and also guide the practice in sustainable use of these wild species. And I think this is a crucial aspect where paleontological studies can make invaluable contribution. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, funding sources, and my past and current institutes for all the support, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.